Hey there, I'm Aqsa, a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm super excited to chat with you about my research on analyzing third party service dependencies in Africa. But before we dive into the nitty gritty details, let me tell you why this topic is so important. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Back in 2016, there was a DDoS attack called the Mirai attack, which took down a huge number of our favorite web services, as you can see on the screen. How the attackers were able to pull off such a massive feat? Let's take a closer look at what happened. The reason behind this chaos was that several websites, including Netflix, exclusively relied on Dyn, a third-party DNS provider, to act as their authoritative named server. So when Dyn was attacked, all the websites using Dyn went offline. Prior works have looked at identifying other search Dyn-like single points of failure. In fact, in 2020 in IMC, research findings indicated that third-party dependencies similar to the one responsible for the 2016 DDoS attack are widespread throughout the world. The research specifically examined globally popular web services from a US vantage point. On the other hand, a different previous study revealed that the prevalence of third-party dependencies varies significantly across different countries. This indicates that the findings of the IMC 2020 research may not be applicable to all countries and regions. Therefore, in this work, we aim to examine the prevalence of third-party dependencies in the African region. You may be wondering, why Africa? Well, it turns out that African countries have also fallen victim to attacks similar to the Mirai Dyn incident. To illustrate further, in 2019, Rwanda's National Data Center, a major DNS provider in the country, was attacked. Similarly, in 2022, both AfriHost and XNilo, which are DNS service providers in South Africa, were also targeted in attacks. These instances demonstrate the pressing need to examine the prevalence of third-party dependencies in the African region. In addition to the rise in DDoS attacks, previous studies have largely ignored the African region, naively assuming that global observations also apply in Africa entail risks, as it underestimates the practicality of certain attacks and creates false assurances. Furthermore, it is worth noting that many African countries have low levels of cyber readiness, which makes it particularly challenging to defend against and recover from cyber attacks. This further emphasizes the need to study the African region. In our research, we aim to investigate the following questions. First, we want to see how widespread are third-party dependencies in Africa, and are websites in the African region utilizing a diverse range of providers, or are they relying heavily on just a few, creating potential single points of failure? Answering these two questions will tell us if African users and African websites are vulnerable to Mirai-like attacks or not. Additionally, we will compare our findings in Africa to the US as a baseline to see if Africa is better or worse. During this presentation, I'll begin by outlining our measurement methodology. Following that, I'll discuss our main findings and present our relevant recommendations based on research. So to address these questions, our first step involves identifying the services that are critical to a user's access to websites. We achieve this by examining the lifecycle of a web request and identify DNS, CDN, and certificate revocation checking by the CA as the main services. Note that these are the same services picked by the IMC 2020 paper. Given that Africa comprises more than 50 countries, it is not feasible to conduct a comprehensive study of all these countries, as it is very hard to find measurement vantage points. As a result, we have selected 4 vantage points from various regions of the continent, including East, West, South, and Central Africa. Unfortunately, we were not able to find a vantage point in North Africa. Once we have identified the critical services and vantage points, our next task is to determine which websites to measure. So far, prior works have only focused on popular websites. We recognize that focusing solely on popular websites may not provide a comprehensive understanding of the situation, as it overlooks less well-known sites that could still be critical, for example, banking websites. Hence, we identify 4 website sets, namely popular websites, which are visited the most by African users, dominant websites, which predominantly target African users, hosted websites, which are hosted inside of Africa, and operated websites, which are operated inside of Africa. So for all of our 4 countries, we create these 4 sets and analyze. For the popular websites, we use the Google Crux website list of top 10,000 websites in each African country that we consider. For dominant websites, we use many heuristics like phone number mentioned on the web page, etc. For hosted websites, we see geo-IP location. And for operated websites, we see the country or jurisdiction mentioned in the terms and conditions or privacy policy of websites. So given these services and websites, we need to identify what exactly we want to measure. For example, we are interested in third-party dependency, which means that a website, let's say Business Daily Africa, uses another entity, Route 53, for DNS services. So we say that Business Daily Africa has a third-party dependency on Route 53, or if it uses Cloudflare as its CDN. We're also interested in critical dependency, which means that here, if Route 53 goes down, Business Daily Africa will also go down, because it critically depends on Route 53 for DNS services. So in the case of DNS and CDN, we measure critical dependency by looking at if the website is exclusively relying on on a single provider, or is it redundantly provisioned. For CA, we look at OCSP stapling. If a website has enabled OCSP stapling, then the user doesn't have to go in real time and check for OCSP status. The OCSP response would come stapled from the web server itself. So now that we have described our methodology, let's jump to the findings. So I'll start by answering the question, to what extent do African websites rely on third-party services? So the graph here shows the percentage of websites with a third-party DNS dependency for different website sets. Each color of the bar represents a country. Overall, we see that more than 90% of the websites use a third-party DNS, CDN, or CA provider across all the countries. This means no matter where you are in Africa or what you visit, you are highly vulnerable to the side effects of third-party dependency. If we look at critical dependency, we see that critical dependency is also highly prevalent, particularly in the case of DNS. For example, in this figure, we show the percentage of critical dependency for South Africa. We see that in the case of DNS, for all the website sets, more than 93% of the websites critically depend on a DNS, more than 75% critically depend on a CDN provider, and more than 66% critically depend on a CA provider. Furthermore, if we split our website sets across ranks as top 1000 and top 10,000, we see that more popular websites are less critically dependent across all sets. For example, in the case of South Africa popular websites, in the top 10,000, we see that 93% are critically dependent, and in the top 1,000, 86% are critically dependent. Which means that more popular websites are more resilient. Now that we have identified the third-party dependencies in Africa, are highly prevalent, we try to see if the dependence is on a few providers or is the space more diverse in Africa. Because third-party dependencies can do widespread damage only if the dependency is on a few providers. We see that only 3 DNS providers critically serve 50 to 60% of the websites across all countries and all website sets. Here we show the dependency graph of popular websites in South Africa. The size of a node is proportional to its N degree, which means the number of websites depending on it. Here, Xnilo is a local South African provider However, for other countries, we do not see any local provider in the top providers for popular sites. Similar to DNS, only 3 CDN providers critically serve 40 to 50% of the websites across all the countries and all website sets. Here we show the CDN dependency graph of popular websites in Nigeria. And as previously described, we do not really see any local provider here. In the case of CA also, only 3 CA providers critically serve 45 to 60% of all the websites and countries. Here we show the CA dependency graph for Kenya. Like CDN, we do not see any local CA provider in any country. When we look at more specialized sets, such as the hosted, dominant, and operated website sets, we do see local providers. For example, here in the Kenya hosted set, we see that 2 of the 3 main providers are actually local Kenyan providers. One is the Kenya Education Network and the other is the Safari.com. But this trend was only visible for DNS. For CDN and for CA, we don't really see any local provider. Now that we have observed the prevalence and concentration of Africa-specific websites, let's see how it compares to the US, which is more advanced in terms of cyber readiness and has more diversity of providers. Note that to compare with the US, we only compare the popular sets because we want to draw direct conclusions and differences from the IMC 2020 study, which also studies the popular set. In general, we found that Africa popular websites are more critically dependent than the US. For example, here we show the difference in critical dependency for South Africa when compared to the US. In the case of DNS, we see that in South Africa, the critical dependency is 7% more. For CDN, it is roughly similar, and for CA, it is 12% more. Furthermore, if we look at more popular top 1,000 websites, we see that the gap further increases. For example, in the case of CDN, the gap from -1%, it goes to 8%. And in the case of CA, the gap goes from 12% to 21%. Which means that in the US, popular websites are more resilient than Africa. This brings us to our takeaways. So we say that third-party dependencies in Africa are highly prevalent and there is a high degree of concentration. But what are the implications of that? So we know that third-party critical dependencies are very widespread in Africa, and we also saw that there is huge concentration, which means that there are huge single points of failure, which means that African websites are vulnerable to Mirai-like DDoS attacks. Furthermore, this problem is sort of exacerbated by the low cyber readiness and the nascent security measures already prevalent in Africa. For example, if there is a DDoS attack, it can take longer for an African provider to cope with it than others. In addition, we also saw that there is a sparsity of local providers which actually promotes concentration. For CDN and CA, we absolutely saw no local provider, and for DNS, we saw some, but they were not really prevalent. To conclude, we analyzed third-party service dependencies in Africa, and our key findings are that more than 90% of Africa-specific websites are critically dependent, and an attack on a single provider can take down 30% of the African websites. When we compare Africa to the US, we see that third-party and critical dependency is higher in Africa than the US. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.